Bill and Ben, Bill and Ben, Bill and Ben, Bill and Ben, flower pot men, flower pot men, flower pot men, Bill and Ben, Bill and Ben, flower pot men.
Once upon a time, there was a little house. And all round the house was a beautiful garden. And down at the bottom of the garden was a place where the man who worked in the garden left his things while he went into the house to have his dinner. One day, when he'd gone into the house to have his dinner, he left behind a big wooden basket full of vegetables and some flower pots. 2 little ones, 2 middle-sized ones, and 2 great big ones. And just behind the big flower pots was a little weed. And there they all were, lying quietly in the warm sunshine. The little weed looked all about her, and when she saw that everything was quiet, she knocked gently on one of the flower pots. Weed, weed! And slowly, out of one of the big flower pots, came a flower pot man. First his little head with a hat on, then one little hand with a big garden glove, and in the other hand he had a stick. He leaned over and said,
That's
that's the flower pot way of saying, "Hello, little weed, I'm the only flower pot man awake." And the little weed laughed.
Oh, weed, weed!
And the flower pot man thought she meant someone was coming, so he popped down into his flower pot again. Then the little weed knocked on the other flower pot.
Weed, weed!
And slowly, out of the other big flower pot, came the other flower pot man. First his little head with a hat on, then one hand with a big garden glove, and up came another hand with a stick in it. He leaned over and said, which was his way of saying, "Hello, little weed, I'm the only flower pot man awake." And the little weed laughed.
Oh, weed, weed!
And the flower pot man thought she meant someone was coming, so he popped down into his flower pot again. After a time, the first flower pot man said to himself, "Surely there's nobody about," and popped his head up for a minute to have a look round. Then the other flower pot man thought, "Surely there's no one about," and he popped his head up. And they went on like this for quite a long time. And all that meant, let's get out and play. So out they came and ran about with their great big garden boots on, made of real leather.
A globe.
when they'd had enough dancing about, they flopped down for a rest. And then they began to look round for something to play with. One of them saw a tiny little ladybird crawling across the garden, so small that you couldn't see it. And while he was watching it, the other flower pot man had found that big wooden basket full of vegetables, and he thought that would be a fine thing to play with.
Oh, the blue fluff, bubble bubbles.
First, he leaned over and smelled them. And then he got into the basket and he began to poke the vegetables with his stick. First he touched the beans and they made a funny little noise like a bell. Then he thought he'd try the cauliflower. And then the onions. And he wondered what sort of big noise the big vegetable marrow would make. But when he tapped the vegetable marrow, nothing happened. And he said, I really cannot understand why the vegetable marrow doesn't say anything. It's very strange. By this time, the other flower pot man had come over to see what his friend was doing. And of course, he wanted to do it too. But his friend was very naughty, and he thought he'd play a trick on him. And he said, you can play the vegetable marrow because it's the biggest. But he didn't tell him that it wouldn't say anything. Are you ready, he said, but don't begin until I tell you.
Or up, or do re-bop. Glop.
The first flower pot man couldn't believe his ears. He couldn't think why the marrow wouldn't play for him if it would for his friend.
Oh, huddle, hobble, globble, glob. Dop, top, nop. Mop, mop. No, mop. Oh, no, mop, 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 mop.
Then the one who could make the marrow sing said to the other, never mind, let's play both together. You play the other vegetables, and I'll play the marrow.
Oh, that bottle, and plod the lull. Do plod the huddle bottle bottle, and up plod the muddle. Or do rub up? Glob. Oh, lovely.
All this time, the little weed was keeping a sharp lookout to see if anyone was coming. And she'd seen all that the flower pot men did. Now, you know what their names are, don't you? Bill and Ben. You listen, because little weed is going to ask a question about them.
Was it Bill or was it Ben? Made the marrow sing just then. Which of those two flower-pot men? Was it Bill or was it Ben?
Did you hear what the little weed said? Do you know which one it was? You listen again.
Was it Bill or was it Ben? Made the marrow sing just then. Which of those two flower-pot men? Was it Bill or was it Ben?
Well, was it Bill or was it Ben? It was Ben. It was Ben.
Oh.
Bill and Ben wanted to go on playing, but the little weed thought she heard someone coming, so she called out to tell them that the man who worked in the garden had finished his dinner and was coming out again.
Oh. Oh.
Oh,
So the two little flower-pot men thought they ought to go back into their flower pots and say goodbye to each other. But Bill suddenly remembered that he left his stick behind. So he went back to fetch it. And what do you think he saw?
oh,
A big white squirrel sitting in the basket and eating some of the vegetables.
oh.
The little flower-pot man forgot all about his stick. He just stared and stared. Then he said, "What are you doing?"
What'll you do, Pip? What'll you do, Pip?
And the big white squirrel said,
Eating, eating.
Then Bill said, "Do you like beans?"
Double blub bleep. Yes, I like beans.
Then Bill said, "Don't you like onions?"
Doodle double oddle. No.
But just then Ben came running in to say that the little weed was getting very cross and that he must hurry up.
Oh.
But when he saw the squirrel, he forgot all about the little weed too.
Oh.
Bill said to him, "You ask the squirrel if she likes cauliflower." Then Ben said,
Double up, couple flubble.
No, I like beans.
Bill and Ben wanted to stay with the squirrel, but Little Weed was simply shouting for them to go back.
Oh.
Oh,
Oh, bawa squiffluffle.
power squiffluffle. Oh, oh.
Oh, Rob.
Oh, Rob. Oh.
So then at last they got back to their flower pots. And then they said goodbye to each other.
Power.
Bawa.
Then they said goodbye to the little weed.
Power bit of weed. And over and a straw along and a squiffle over in the blobby. I don't. Power.
Weed!
Bawa.
Weed! The little weed stayed behind the flower pots and went fast asleep. And there they all stayed in the warm sunshine. But the man who worked in the garden didn't know that anything had happened at all. Nobody knew about the flower pot men. Only you saw them playing. And the little weed. And I think the little house knew something about it. Don't you?
Goodbye, Bill. Goodbye, Ben. Bill and Ben, flower pot men. Goodbye, Bill. Goodbye, Ben. Bill and Ben.